Warning: tube amplifiers have lethal voltages inside them. Please do not attempt to build, test, or repair these without understanding and following all safety protocols. Hey y'all! Well, this is the first of a series on this Muzishare X7, and this is another KT88 push-pull made in China amplifier that we're going to be repairing, reviewing, and then doing some mods on. And after just doing the R8, it's going to be interesting to see how this slightly higher price point Muzishare item compares to the R8. One thing you'll probably note that this uses 9-pin tubes instead of the octal tubes for the driver and phase splitters, which not going to hold it against it. These 9-pin tubes can sound really good, so I don't think that's a negative. It's also got a tube rectifier. We'll see how that plays into the design and layout. Also comes with a set of KT88 tubes that are biased with a fixed bias, little adjusters with these 2 meters on the front via these knobs. The reason it's here is the owner said this knob was no longer showing the bias on this side of the amp. Well, I can't remember. It might have been this side. But irregardless, one of the meters was no longer switching from the VU meter to the tube bias. So he wasn't able to check or adjust the bias. He knew that was an issue, and he contacted me, and I said, sure, send it over. And we're going to be going through the diagnostic process on seeing what exactly is wrong with the amp, getting it so we can test stuff to see what's going on safely, because you don't want to just power this thing up with a possible bias problem failure and tear up or destroy some of these KT88 tubes. So we're going to go through that. We're also going to look at the layout, my initial impressions on the quality, just all that kind of stuff, and kind of go over the features, plus and minus of this thing, and then wrap this up at the end with kind of an overview of what's going on with this and what we're going to do. So let's open this thing up. Okay, just open this thing up, and again, it's here for repairs to the bias meter acting weird. And I'm not sure whether we have a problem with one of the bias pots and there's an actual problem with the bias negative supply, or if the meter's acting weird, or the switch up here that switches between the tubes in the VU meter, or the problem, or what's going on. But before I power this thing up and start poking around in here looking at voltages, I wanted to just kind of eyeball what's going on inside this amp and do a little comparison between this and the R8 that I just did all that modification work on. Well, the first thing I noticed is it does have these similar looking resistors that the R8 had, but thankfully none of these have the coating blown off of them. And I don't know if these are just higher quality resistors or what the issue with the R8 was, but thankfully, given the zillion of resistors that are up here on this front end, that we don't have that same problem, because I would not want to have to come in here and replace all these resistors. The other thing to note as far as modability, if you were looking for an amp that you wanted to do some mods on, and we'll get some closer shots of this in future segments, but given that this amp has these 9-pin tubes, this is some really crowded stuff to have to work in. And the way these coupling caps are installed, even replacing those would be kind of a challenge, or at least a lot more work than they were on the R8. But they also have the coupling caps directly connected to the phase splitter to this tag strip going to the output tube, instead of like running over to a board over here and then back over to the tubes with the signal going through circuit board traces. So I compliment them on that they did hook these up directly to the pins on the phase splitter tubes, which are these outboard ones. I haven't looked at a schematic yet to see exactly how they're doing this. It appears that this center tube is the gain. I'm not sure if they have a two-stage and then a phase splitter triode, or how exactly they've got these wired up. But hey, we'll look into that when we get to that point. I have a feeling that they're using this center tube for the gain or voltage amplification, and then using these two outer tubes for the phase splitters. And it looks like they're using a grounded grid type phase splitter just like the R8 did. Now, one interesting thing I noted, this amp does have a 5AR4 rectifier tube. But then when I look in here, there's also a bridge rectifier in addition to the tube rectifier. And I haven't been able to follow all these wires exactly because they are zip tied up pretty tight. But it appears that they're using a bridge rectifier in these two caps to power the KT88s, and then they're using the rectifier tube to power the front end tubes. So it's kind of a combination of solid state and tube rectification. Anyway, not saying that this is a bad thing, and actually these solid state bridge rectifiers are going to have almost zero sag, and so it's really going to give the output tubes a punchier sound than it would with a tube rectifier on a push-pull amp. Also note this has got the 3 Henry 180 milliamp choke, and depending on how these KT88 tubes are biased, that may be pushing the limit of what this thing is capable of, and it would also limit how hot you could bias these KT88 tubes if you decide to experiment with biasing them at a different operating point. Has the same 450 volt caps. All these are 470 UF instead of 330 UF like the R8 used, and it'll be interesting to see if this amp has the same issue with these going past their rated voltage on power up and possibly need to be upgraded to a higher voltage rating cap like we did on the R8. Now this amp also has a phono input, and here's the phono stage over here. It's a little circuit board with who knows what kind of solid state components that are doing the phono stage part of the amplification, which they're amplifying the moving magnet input voltage up to something the amp can deal with. Not a big fan of these small solid state phono stages, so I mean, while this will work, it would probably sound much better with a higher quality phono stage if you wanted to do an upgrade. But this will at least get you started and let you listen to some vinyl without having to buy something extra. Looks like it has the similar type wiring that the R8 did on the speaker connections, where these wires run around the world up here to this front headphone jack. And again, if you're not using this for a headphone amp, which honestly I'm not sure why somebody would be using a KT88 push-pull 45 watt amp to listen to music with their headphones, I would recommend rewiring this and running this ground directly to the negative speaker terminal and eliminating this headphone jack wiring. So looking at the biasing pots and how they're set up, okay, the negative voltage comes in on this white wire. I'm going to have to do some looking at how this is all wired up, but it's possible that this has the safety resistors that were missing on the R8 to keep the amp from running away and red plating. And that's to ensure that if the wiper fails on one of these cheap potentiometers, that we still get negative voltage over here to the grids of the output tubes so they don't go nuclear and start blowing up stuff. It looks like it's using the same system that the R8 used, which is pretty common on putting a 10 ohm resistor between the cathode and ground, and then the meter wires come up to the cathode and it measures the voltage drop across this 10 ohm resistor. Now one thing I don't like is it looks like they've used a really big cathode resistor, and I would rather see something like a 1 watt at the max used for these cathode resistors, so that if the tube does red plate, this resistor will blow out before it takes out the output transformers or does some other damage inside the amp. But they may have felt, since they put these safety resistors in, if in fact they did, that the tube's likely not going to do that. So at this point, given kind of a cursory look over this thing, honestly, I feel like this is a little nicer looking inside than the R8 is. And like I said, it's not as mod friendly as the R8, but maybe this thing doesn't need mods like the R8 did. And especially if these coupling capacitors are okay, which they appear to be a fairly nice size coupling capacitor. And that's kind of a sign that they're actually audio quality and probably a pretty decent coupling cap. Now these little guys look a little cheap, but these are the ground grid capacitors for the phase splitter, and they're not as critical as far as being in the signal path. The other thing I applaud them for is they do have grid stoppers installed on the grids of the KT88s that were missing on the R8. So at this point, before I power this thing up with the output tubes in it, I want to make sure that I've got negative voltage here on the grids of the KT88s to make sure that we're not just turning the amp on to have it red plate. And I'm going to pull it up on a variac so I don't exceed the voltage of these caps, because we do have a solid state bridge rectifier that we're going to have B+ on these caps even with the rectifier tube removed. So we won't have any voltage on the front end, but we are going to have voltage on these caps. And so I want to, again, pull it up on a variac to make sure we don't exceed the voltage of these caps and blow these things up before we even get started. So let me hook this thing up to the variac and we'll start doing some voltage tests, see what kind of negative voltage we have on the grids of these tubes, get it adjusted to something that's reasonable if these pots are still operational, and then put the output tubes in and see what this issue is with the meter. It could be these not working, which would be bad. It could be these switches have got dirty or not working or not making a connection and not reliably reading this voltage drop across the cathode of these tubes. And in that case, we'll have to work on the meters and figure out that part of the circuit and see why that's not working. So let's get this thing hooked up to the variac and start doing our tests. Okay, so we have our voltmeter hooked up. Got the ground clip over here on the ground wire so we can do this voltage testing with one hand behind my back so that we're doing this as safe as we can. We have this hooked up to a variac and a isolation transformer. And so we're going to set this on about probably 60 volts to start with. Start at about half voltage. And power this thing up. Okay, so we got 260 volts there and 260 volts there. So I'm going to turn this up slowly. And I want to make sure I don't go past the voltage these big capacitors are rated for to do this testing. So we're right at 410 volts, and we've only got 100 volts AC going into this. So I have a feeling this is going to be just like on the R8, where on power up, the B+ voltage out of this bridge rectifier is going to blow past the rating of these capacitors, even with all the tubes installed. So the main thing we're testing here is we want to see if we've got negative voltage on the grids of these output tubes and what that voltage is. So let's come in here and test this first tube here. And we got negative 27 volts, which probably really isn't enough for a KT88. Now, one thing I will say, when the owner was testing the bias and saw the meter going crazy, I think he was turning the potentiometers, trying to get the voltage to come in line. So we could have an issue that we don't have the meter accurate, and he's twisting the potentiometers trying to get the meters to work when that's not the problem. So we'll come in here and check this one. That one's on -20. That's more what we want to see. -43 volts and -43 volts. Now if we'd powered this thing up with the tubes installed with the bias set there, that's a really hot bias with the voltage turned down that low on these two tubes. And I'd have to go look at his email, but I think this is the channel that the meter was acting crazy on. So let me get a screwdriver and adjust this voltage up to about 45 or 43 volts. And then I think it's safe to put the KT88 tubes in, and then we can start seeing what kind of current we have on the cathodes, and then check out what the meters are doing. Okay, so now let's just run back through one more time. Got -43, -43, -43, and -43. That should be close enough for the bias adjustment. So I'll be back in a second after I put the tubes in and power this thing up and see what's going on. Okay, so you can see I've got the amp up on its side so the heat can come off of these tubes and we don't have them upside down, because sometimes that can cause weird things to happen. Those tubes don't really like being run upside down. So I messed around with the meter, and let me see. I don't know if I can get this on the camera or not. Okay, so I know this is upside down, but I still think you can see it. So you can see when I switch between the different tubes, it's staying on right at what should be 40 milliamps according to this meter. As you can see, I'm switching between the two tubes. Meter's not moving. We get the same reading on all four tubes now, with the amp standing up where the tubes aren't getting too hot. So let me show you what this is in actual milliamps measured on this meter. Got 41.6 right there at 41, 41.5, 41.9. These meters are perfectly accurate. I don't think they're the problem. I think what may have been going on is the bias pots have got dirt in them. And they probably weren't super high quality bias pots to start with. And that they were what was making these voltages or these meters go crazy, and the owner couldn't get the bias adjusted, was that the bias pots have got dust in them, and that's the problem. I am noticing they're like hypersensitive, which makes it really hard to adjust. The other thing we have going on, now that we got these even, let me show you what the grid voltages are. There's -44 on this tube. We're starting on this end down here. So we got -44. Got -46. Then another -46. And way down at -39 to get that one to run. Now, these two are real similar. As you can see, you got -46, -46.5. So these two tubes paired together, and these two center ones put on one end, would work fine. And if I was having to work with these tubes, I would put this -44 volt one, and then this one down here on the other end, that's at -39 together on the other channel. I'm not as concerned when you have tubes that are like the left and right channels don't match, but on a push-pull amp, the pairs of tubes need to match. And on this amp, they don't. So I'm going to talk to the customer and look at replacing these bias pots. And then before we stop here, I want to see what kind of voltage this amplifier makes across these capacitors on power up before the tubes start conducting, and see if we potentially may need to replace those as well as just kind of a bottom tier of what this amp needs to be safe. Okay, so we're going to do one last test here. We got our ground hooked up, and then we've got the probe here on the positive side of this big capacitor. We're going to power this thing up. This is with the output tubes in place, and see what this voltage goes to. And there's 470. Just what I suspected. Blows past the rating of these caps, about 20 volts. And you saw for about how long. Not the end of the world. They'll survive that, but it's not ideal. And for longevity, we probably should be replacing these with some 500 volt units, at least, maybe some 550s. There's plenty of room here to have a little bit taller capacitor. I'll have to measure the diameter of these and see what I can find. The other thing that is problematic is this choke is only rated for 180 milliamps. I've honestly got no idea what the power transformer is rated for, to know if we can push these tubes hotter by putting a 250 milliamp choke in it like we did in the R8. We probably can. 40 milliamps on a KT88 is super cold biased. It's really not a whole lot hotter than what you would bias some EL34 tubes. And so you're really not getting, out of these tubes what they're capable of doing. I found that it doesn't change the power a whole lot, but it does change the sound of the tubes. And so, going to look and see if that same Hammond choke that fit in the R8 will bolt into this amp, and that might be worth upgrading for the $30 that costs, especially if we're going to be coming in here and replacing these capacitors as well. So that's kind of the starting point on this amp, and I think I just want to get it to a point where it's safe and reliable. And then I'm also going to hook this thing up and see what it sounds like. I've never listened to one of these, and just see what this thing sounds like compared to the R8. See if it's got any hum issues or anything else we need to be addressing. And I think too, since I am going to be coming in here and replacing these bias pots, I personally, for my own use, I would like to have one where the shafts go through the top of the amp, so you don't have to fish through that little hole with a screwdriver to adjust the bias. I mean, I know why they do that, so people don't accidentally hit those, but they're right up next to the hot tubes. Who's going to be sticking their fingers up there anyway? And so, let me look into that. Let me talk to the owner and see what we're going to do, and I think this is a good place to wrap up this first video on this Muzishare X7. Well, after recording the video on the diagnostic part of this, I had a more in-depth conversation with the owner of this amp. And from what he describes, I think what we've probably got going on is a combination of dirt in this switch here, this three-way switch that switches between the VU meters in both the tubes, and also some dust or dirt inside the potentiometers to adjust the bias, because they're very jumpy and they'll jump ahead and back, and I'm worried about these potentiometers. So got a parts order going in. Gonna find some potentiometers that I can replace these with. I'm gonna use some Deox spray that I have on these switches. They're actually open switches. If you look at the inside of them, you can see the contacts rotating and stuff, so it doesn't shock me that they got either a little bit of corrosion on them or they've gotten some dust in them. And so spraying some Deox that leaves a little bit of coating on the contacts to help keep them from corroding should keep that happening in the future. And now that the owner knows it, if it does it again, I'll tell him just to switch back and forth like this rapidly a half a dozen times and see if then the meter starts working right again. I'm also going to check all the solder joints with the amp powered up with like a wood stick and poke around in there like a chopstick and make sure that we don't have a cold solder joint somewhere that was causing this issue. Like you saw, those big power caps really need to be 500 volt rated. So I found some of those on Mauser. They weren't super expensive. We're going to replace those. He wants to go ahead and replace that choke. And then I talked to him about these tubes not being matched. Turns out he's bought a set of those Shuggy KT88-Zs, that another set of tubes that I really like in this series. He's got a matched set of those that he's mailing me. So we can put a matched set of tubes in there and check them and make sure they're actually a matched set. And so that'll resolve that issue. And then basically see where we are from there. He also wants to go ahead and redo the wiring and take this headphone jack out of the circuit because he's never going to use it for headphones. And while I'm doing that and doing these capacitor upgrades on the power caps, I can look at the grounding scheme. It looks like this amp is using more of a star ground setup than the R8 did. And so kind of an overview on this. Haven't listened to it yet, so I can't really comment on what this thing sounds like sonically, but looking at the build quality and the components, just the fact that the resistors don't have to all be replaced and that the coupling cap looks higher quality, this looks like a better amplifier than an R8, just out of the box. Now I will say the R8 is a more moddable amplifier if you're into doing that kind of stuff and you want to get in there and play around with stuff. There's some cool things about the R8, and it does have that voltage stabilizer divider tube that might sonically help the R8 in the long run. But for an out-of-the-box product to use, I think this is a better choice. The other thing is it does also have a phono stage. It probably uses op amps and whatever solid state gimmickry to actually get the RI equalization, but you can hook a phono up to this one, which is a bonus. And I kind of like that it just has this switchable input source over here with the shielded wires running up here and not having the relay boards in the back and that extra complication. I mean, some people think those relays are a better way without running the shielded wires up through the amp, but this is definitely a simpler deal. And again, got to hook this thing up to my system. It's probably in good enough shape now with our adjustments to go ahead and hook this thing up and listen to it. So that'll probably be in the next video where I kind of go over, hey, here's what this thing sounds like compared to the R8. Very similar looking KT88 tubes. It's got, their branding on it just like the Wilsenton did, and I'm not sure who makes these. Probably somewhere in China these are being made and then branded for whoever buys them to put in their amps. Definitely not a matched set, which I think is important to at least have matched pairs in a push-pull amp. So, anyway, I think that's kind of it for this video. Hope you're enjoying this content. If you are, please subscribe to the channel. Appreciate all you loyal viewers. Appreciate you Patreon supporters and the people that have supported me on the website. I want to thank the viewers like this guy who sent me this amp to review. I am interested in amps that I haven't reviewed. Even if they need some repairs, send them to me. You just pay for parts, and then I get to use the repair and the mods and all that stuff as part of my channel. So contact me via my website if you're interested in doing that. And until next time, have a nice day.